Good morning, I am WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel, and welcome to Hoard of the Dragon Queen, Episode 8, The Eye of the Storm. Everyone in Greenest slept in the next morning. The last of them faded off to sleep as the sky started lightening. For several hours, the only movement in the town were the guards on patrol on the walls of the keep, and the smoke of the last fires as they finally gutted out. Eventually, the heroes were called for a meeting on the wall overlooking the town by Govenor Nighthill. The sun was high in the sky, and the day was warm, without a single cloud in the sky, as they met and looked over the mostly destroyed town. "Thank you, all of you," Nighthill began, his back to them, hands clasped behind his back, as he looked out at the destruction. "Greenest will survive and rebuild in time for the winter, thanks completely to you and your actions. Last night I asked a lot of you and gave nothing in return. Today, I will ask more, but I will have payment for you." He turned around and faced the party for the first time that morning. "We need to know where they came from and why Greenest was a target. If you find where the camp is located, how many there are, who the leaders are, what is motivating them, and where they plan to strike next, and return here with that information, I will gladly pay each of you 250 gold pieces." Tess stepped forward half a step. "That would be a lot of gold, and we watched them take much of the town's valuables with them." Nighthill nodded. "That is very true. If you can find in return with valuables from the town, that'd be much appreciated. But it is a distant secondary concern to the information I asked you for. I have a decent-sized treasury here in the keep, and although rebuilding will almost empty it, I can spare enough to pay you for what I need to know." "Of course, we'd be more than happy to help," Flintfinder smiled. A wan smile crossed the governor's face before he continued. "Again, thank you. They left to the southeast, and the trail is very easy to spot. It's hard to cover up the trail of that many people moving. While I could probably send out my guard force, it would both leave the town undefended, and I'm sure they would be spotted. A small group such as yourselves has a pretty good chance of making it to the camp unnoticed, and you have proven yourself quite capable in a fight. While we do not have much left, if you need anything for your journey, we will supply it free of charge if we have it. And forevermore, you all have a place here in Greenest." "Thank you, Governor. We will be back here as soon as we can with the information you need," Flintfinder said before the group briefly stopped back at the room they'd been using and packed. Garrett rubbed his chin. "I'm glad we were offered this job. If he hadn't, I would have still have headed off toward their camp." Morn looked at the halfling at this with curiosity. "Why? Surely you wouldn't want to join them or anything." Garrett chuckled. "Of course not. However, I am in the area investigating rumors of dragons. There was a dragon attack that happened as part of the main attack last night. Not to mention that dragon man that Flintfinder fought, and all the kobolds. They seem to have information that might be helpful to my investigation." Cora nodded. "That does seem very likely. Either way, I am with you, Garrett. Dragon slaying is in my blood, and while I have not been the best example of my family, it's about time that changed." Morn looked at Mara, and they shrugged at each other, before Morn started talking. "We are for sure with you guys through this mission. Greenest is a home to us. And the most help we can be right now is going to the camp. We will continue to do what is best for our town, but what that is after the camp is not exactly clear. As he finished speaking, Mara nodded her agreement. Flintfinder smiled. Of course I am in. People are in danger, and we have the ability to help. There is no question in my mind. I'm very glad to hear that similar thoughts are going through your heads. Focus started subtly shifting toward Tess, the last person to speak up at this point. A defensive look came over her face. Of course I'm going with you. I'd be foolish to turn down so much gold. What else would I do? There's no reason to stay in town right now, and leaving town on one's own would be suicidal. There were mixed nods and shrugs in response to her words. While her reasoning might not have been the best or the most altruistic, she wasn't wrong. It was clear that this ad hoc group would continue to exist as a cohesive whole for at least a little longer. Eventually they had everything packed and were heading out of town when they were stopped by a clearly injured man in monk's robes, limping heavily on a bandaged leg. I hear you intend to follow the raiders and see where they have gone. I would like nothing better than to come with you, but in this condition, I'd just slow you down. He smiled momentarily. In the midst of all this tragedy, there is no reason you would have heard about the fate of my master, Leosin Erlinthar. Flintfinder cut in at that moment. Leosin? What happened to him? The monk's eyebrow raised at this, but he continued. He is a monk from Burdusk. He disappeared last night, after we fought a particularly savage battle against the raiders. A few others and I fought our way to the keep. Barely. Leosin didn't make it at all. We went back this morning to look for him, but all we found was his broken staff and this choker, which he always wore. Why did Leosin come here? He sent me a message a while ago telling me to come here. Leosin has been investigating these raiders for months. I fear that he might have tried to infiltrate their group when they retreated. Or worse, was captured and carried away as a prisoner. No one understands these bandits better than he does, and his knowledge will be invaluable against them. When you find their camp, please look for any sign that Leosin is there. One of my brothers has already departed for Burdusk to bring back help, but it'll be many days before help arrives. Anything you can do before then would be a godsend. Flintfinder nodded. Yes, we will look for him. Several years ago, Leosin saved my life, and it will be my pleasure to repay him that debt. The group quickly left after that exchange, having realized that time was their enemy. The sooner they could reach the raider camp, the less time the camp would have to get things together, which would make it easier for them to sneak in. They started across the grassland that made up this area of the Sword Coast. The trail of raiders was not difficult to follow, and even a lay person could clearly make out the tracks left behind. After a couple of miles, Tess stopped and stared at some of the tracks. Do you guys notice anything odd about them? The rest of the group stopped and started looking as well, but only Mara seemed to realize what Tess was looking at. Yeah, these tracks. She pointed to the large reptile tracks heading away from town. Are much deeper than these other tracks. She then pointed to the same reptile tracks, this time heading toward town. It's almost as if they're much heavier. She trailed off for a moment before her eyes went wide. Oh, of course. The implication of how much loot must have actually been taken from Greenest hung heavily in the air for a few seconds as everyone processed it. As that information had finally finished fully sinking in, Quara pointed off into the distance. Look there, smoke! It looks like a campfire. Everyone looked up at where she was pointed and murmured their agreements. A couple miles further along this apparently straight trail came the unmistakable smoke cloud from a small fire. It appeared that the smoke was coming from an area where the flat, featureless grassland gave way to gently rolling hills that themselves gave way to steep-sided rocky plateaus. Let's approach from one of these hills, and assuming they're not looking out, watch them for a few minutes before we descend upon them, Flintfinder suggested. His demeanor shifted to something none of the rest of the group had seen before. He had become almost feral in that moment, as he planned the best way to approach this problem. Thank you so much for listening to Episode 8 of Hoard of the Dragon Queen. Make sure you tune in tomorrow for the next episode of the Monster Manual Backward, and tune in next Tuesday for Episode 9 of Hoard of the Dragon Queen, Into the Camp.